Hello, welcome to a bonus episode of HT Youth Connect. Welcome to Genesis Questions, or questions about Genesis, or big...
Really catchy. It's going well. We're working on it, guys. We're working on it.
Big Genesis questions. Basically, what we're going to do, I'm here, I'm Steve, this is Ellie. I can't remember which side of me she is. She's one of the two sides of it. Every week we're going to take 10 minutes or so to answer some questions about Genesis that you guys have submitted. We actually ended up getting more questions this week than we can fit into one video, which is great. So if we're not answering a question today, we will answer it in a future week. We're just going to do kind of 2 or 3 at a time, and then you can send us your questions on Instagram, or you can send me an email, or you can send them in
by post if you're really old school. Steve loves getting mail, so
by post, yes, snail mail. Maybe not just a question though. I'd be a bit disappointed.
Oh yeah.
Like a card or a letter. Anyway, we've had a think. We've got our notes. We're going to have a chat. I really hope this is helpful and gets you thinking. And maybe we'll post some more resources below in the description as well, so you can see where we got our ideas from. But our first question was: is Genesis 1 literally true or not? And if it's not, how can it be true at all? Ellie, you want to kick us off with this one?
Yeah, good question, actually. So I think the first thing to do when thinking about any questions to do with text like Genesis is to start off with thinking about genre. So we're used to talking about genre when we're picking a film. So if you're watching a musical, you'd expect something way different to if you're watching a documentary. Unless you're watching a documentary about a musical, or a musical about a documentary. Actually, that's not helpful. But the main point is, we use genres to group things, and so we know what to expect. So when we're talking about Genesis is actually an origin narrative. That's its genre. And these were a big thing back in the day, as in 2000 BC, and all the cool kids were writing them. But with origin narratives, the whole thing that they're doing is they're stories that cultures tell about themselves as a way to define themselves and explain what they're all about. But with Genesis, it's actually different to a lot of the other creation narratives or origin narratives that are around at the time, because the story that Genesis is telling is one about a God who creates a good world and who creates human beings to be in relationship with him. And this is pretty radical. Most of the other creation narratives around the same time are about God's creating humans so they can have a nice snack. So Genesis is different in that way. So that's kind of some ways to start thinking about how we read Genesis. But I haven't really answered why we should take anything from it if it's not literally true. So Steve, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think that's really helpful, thinking about what genre it is. The second part of the question is a really good question. I mean, I think it's something that I got hung up on a lot earlier in my life, because you think well, if it's not true, if it's not like history, then how is it true? I think it's a bit like, Jesus tells parables, and he tells a story, like the story of the prodigal son or the good Samaritan, these famous parables. And they're not literally true, right? Jesus made up these stories, but they illustrate something or explain something that is literally true. So, in the case of the prodigal son story, it's a made up story, but it explains something which is true about God and the way that he celebrates it when people come back to him. And that's literally true. And I think it's the same with Genesis. So it's illustrating, it's telling a story which itself is not kind of historically literally true, but it illustrates a point which is true, which is I think you were saying, Ellie, about God creating the world, God making it good, God's complete control over all of creation. I mean, there's a lot we could go into about what it says. And if you haven't already, you should watch our Youth Connect videos if you're watching this, because they hopefully will go into more depth about all of those kinds of things. Do you think that makes sense, Ellie?
Yeah. So something can be a story, but it can also have something profoundly true to say about the world. And I suppose often stories are a really good way of telling a truth, because we have to get into the story and imagine what it's like. Whereas if someone just tells you something that's true, you're kind of yeah, okay, whatever. But if they tell you a story and there's a moral to the story, you're well, I get this. So I think that's kind of what's going on in Genesis too.
Exactly. And it's also what's going on when physics lessons are really boring.
Yeah, exactly.
Let's on the topic of science, our second question is, how does evolution fit into the creation story? And if we've evolved from animals, how is mankind different from everything else? I'm going to start us on this because I did a whole load of reading about this when I was 18, when I was preparing for my university interviews. But Darwin, who sort of popularized the theory of evolution, was a Christian, and he told loads of Christians about evolution when he kind of was writing about it. And the majority of them were like, great, cool. They didn't have a problem with it. One of the first guys he wrote to was a guy called Asa Gray, who was a Christian botanist, as in he studied flowers? Plants. He studied plants.
That's definitely from Harry Potter. Is that a real thing?
No, herbology is the Harry Potter one, right?
Oh, yeah. Oh, no.
Get with the program, Ellie.
I've messed up. Shamed.
This guy, Asa Gray, was a botanist, and he was a Christian. And he was one of the first people who responded to Charles Darwin. And he was like, wow, this is amazing. This just shows us more of how incredible God's design is. And, you know, he didn't see any problem with believing Genesis 1 and that God is the source of it all, but at the same time doing science and realizing more of how that worked kind of from a scientific perspective. And I would say, as a Christian, it's really important to take science really seriously because it tells us stuff about the world that we live in. But it's also important to take seriously that there is more than just science, you know? For me, evolution can fit really, really well into the origins of everything. But I also think that there's something more. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no. Because I think the way that I think about evolution a lot of the time is it's like when we study evolution, we're kind of picking up a trail of clues that are kind of they're revealing more of this beautiful, intricate process through which, like, at the end of it, humanity takes shape. And I think for me, that actually points more towards a designer, an architect, a creator, because it seems like it is full of purpose and full of design. So I think that's kind of I'm like the first scientists. I feel like, yeah, they don't have to be two opposing things. Actually, the story of evolution is telling us how God has created stuff, and there's loads of space in that for why is God creating this? Why is there purpose in this? Two different questions, I think.
And the second half of that question about really interesting about what does that mean about humans? I mean, I think sometimes we get hung up on the fact that humans need to be really different. Humans are still animals, and even in Genesis 1, you know, they're not made in a different way. Animals, God says, "Let there be birds and fish and animals," and then He says, "Let there be mankind." So it's not about how we're made that makes us different, but more about the relationship that God has with us. And I guess God has a unique relationship with all the things He's created, and He has a unique relationship with humans. And we're going to talk more in future weeks on Sundays about what exactly that looks like. But I think, I would say the distinction is not necessarily about how we're made, but the relationship He has with us. And I guess we see that ultimately in Jesus. But that's a whole nother tangent that maybe we won't go on right now. Well, it's not really a tangent. It's kind of the central message of Christianity. We won't explain it completely right now. You'll have to watch more Youth Connect videos to find out more about that. Great. Anything to add, Ellie?
No, I think that's probably about it for the big questions.
Awesome. That's it for us for now. But we will answer more questions next week. Keep sending them in. I really hope this is some helpful thoughts for you as you have questions about Genesis. Bye for now.